is a Senior Life Academy located on the campus of the University Park United Methodist Church here in Dallas, Texas. Welcome. I'm Dee Dee Cassad, director of the program, and we are going to have a panel discussion today on the will of God. With me is Diana Wilson, Bill Matthews, Miriam Mathis, and Stephen Fleming. Welcome to you all.
Thank you.
This is a very in-depth discussion because it is hard to understand what is the will of God. But a lot of people use it very, I would say, inappropriately by thinking that everything that happens to them happens to be the will of God. If something bad happens, well, that was just the will of God, but it may not be. So how do we as Christians interpret the will of God?
I took a look to see what Father Richard Rohr had to say about the will of God. Personally, I think the will of God is something I'm always working to understand and be open to. And there's a quote that we used at the last fundraiser here at the church, the Capital Campaign, and we had these stickers made up that we could put on our microwaves or wherever, and it says, Lord, what do you want to do through me? And it's a question because we're trying to figure it out. I don't know that every single day the answer is the same thing. I think sometimes, depending on what's going on, there are different ways to answer. But there's a quote in here I would love to share with you, and Richard Rohr was talking about Bishop Desmond Tutu and how he had a conversation with Desmond Tutu, who was the winner of the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts to end apartheid in South Africa. And so he and Richard were having a conversation one day, and he said, it says here, Tutu summed this up well, this discussion about the will of God, when he told me personally, we are only the light bulbs, Richard, and our job is just to remain screwed in. And I love that because I think that's right on. And I think we call that, when we're talking about being screwed in, I think we call that the kingdom of God. When we're looking for that, trying to be part of it, being open.
Connected.
Mm-hmm.
Has anybody ever asked you, Bill, what the will of God is?
I don't know that they've asked me in so many words. I think a lot of times the question comes up, is this the will of God that such and such has occurred in my life? And I think probably that's the burning question. When there's something that happens that's not very happy, not very fortunate, a loss or some shift in direction for a person. And that, it's a case of not calling God the scapegoat, and I think that's the term that came to my mind when I first started thinking about this question, because it's too easy to blame God for something that may not be God's fault. It may be something that I did inadvertently, or it may be some other force that came into the picture.
It could be human error that causes it, and you blame God for it. When, just like an accident, it could be you were driving too fast, or the other person was on the wrong side of the road. That's not God's will. I mean, that is something definitely that, in my opinion, is human error.
Well, or it's just it's an accident. It's like the Kilauea volcano. That's nobody's fault.
No, absolutely.
And its creation kind of run rampant, but the reaction of the people. I saw a really interesting interview with the Hawaiians who live there, and it's a fairly small village setting where the attack is happening. And there are 36 homes destroyed, the latest count, I think, today. And it's one of those cases, but it's amazing their resilience because they're looking behind that. Somebody called it Aloha number 2 because it's our version 2.0. And they said they're having to call on the resources from their ancient past, and that goes, to pre-Christian era for them. And these people who are living there, because they're really original Hawaiians. And it was beautiful. They said, aloha kekahi I kekahi. That translates, have love for one another. Well, that sounds like something we've heard before in the Christian era.
Absolutely, and it brings to mind the difference between fate and destiny. There's a distinct difference. Fate, you cannot program. You have no
control.
That's right. It's not your ability to control. Destiny is something you can control. So that's a little side thing for that, but nevertheless, But I think that very few people really understand what the will of God is, and yet they're all seeking it. I remember somebody in their prayer, rather than asking, may this be your will, according to God's governance. Is that similar to the will of God, what He governs? How do you see it, Stephen?
Well, we're such bewildered animals here on this planet, looking at the way the cosmos operates in an orderly fashion. It boggles our minds, I think, to try to comprehend what the will of God must be. I do know this: if you may want to be very careful about getting into a discussion with someone who does believe, and many do, that every single thing that happens is a direct consequence of the will of God, whether it's a car wreck or. But we're creatures that have been formed. Our very conception was an act of randomness, as far as we can tell. Just an amazing number of single cell entities getting together, and then chromosomes crossing. The complexity of life is just beyond our fathoming. We may be able to understand greater and greater levels of the mechanics of it, but then we project all of our curiosity about how life came to be what it is onto God, and try to say, well, we're beginning to grasp an understanding of what God's will is. I don't know. I prefer Desmond Tutu's explanation.
Staying screwed in.
We just need to stay, in some sense, plugged in or screwed in to God's love for us. And I think a beautiful biblical example of this is the story of Jonah. God knew what needed to be done, and it was for no other person to go to Nineveh except for Jonah. And he opted to go in the other direction. He had no willingness whatsoever.
You could call that God's intentional will. He intended for him to do that.
Yes, and ultimately he did.
Yes, well, it took a while.
It did.
With detours. I'd like to share one quote that I have here from Thomas Merton about fate. It says, Thomas Merton wrote that the will of God is not a fate to which we submit, but a creative act in our life, producing something absolutely new, something hitherto unforeseen by the laws and established patterns. Our cooperation, and Jonah is a perfect example of a lack of cooperation.
He wasn't screwed in.
He wasn't screwed in. Our cooperation, which is seeking first the kingdom of God, our cooperation consists not solely in conforming to laws, but in opening our wills. I love that you just brought up the Jonah story, because that's what Jonah finally did, opening our wills to this creative act, which must be retrieved in and by us. So we are co-creators with God, and our job is not only to be screwed in and tuned in so that we can have some sense of what is the will of God, because I think people can get messed up there real easy.
I think one of the best scriptures for me is in Romans, the 12th chapter, the 2nd verse, is, "Do not be conformed to this world, but be ye transformed by the renewal of your mind, that you may prove what is the will of God."
Oh, yeah.
Think about that.
That's
how
great.
do you read that, Marion?
Well, I think it echoes or sums up what we've all been talking about, which is to stay plugged in, stay connected, and sometimes our minds and our hearts need to be transformed in order for that to happen, because if we have the Jonah moments where we're kicking and screaming and going backwards and refusing to participate in what God offers us to be a co-creator in. And so when we allow ourselves to be transformed, when we allow ourselves to really be in tune with the heart of God, one thing I read when preparing for this session was that in the Old Testament, one of the Hebrew words that was used to indicate the seat or the place of the will of God, that Yahweh's will was in his heart. His heart was the locus of what he desired for creation and for all of us, and it was also the place where decisions started. And then later on, I read something else that talked about how God initiates and provokes things through us in the history of salvation, and it's our job to be a co-creator, to be an agent with him, to join our agency with
How
him.
do we then help others to discern the will of God for themselves? How do we give them some instruction or thoughts of how they can decide, what is the will for each person? How do we know that? How do we actually know what is the will of God for us? Bill?
Well, I think that's the difficult thing, is seeing how other people operate.
But that is what people, when they come to church, they really are
They wanna
seeking,
know.
what is the will of God for myself? And how do we discern that? That is not an easy thing.
I think there are lots of ways that God speaks to me. I think sometimes I hear the will of God in the voice of friends. I think sometimes I hear things on TV, like documentaries or the news. I think sometimes when I'm going for a quiet walk and thoughts just kind of pop into my head about something that appears to be mine to do. So I think there's lots of avenues. I don't think God just has one,
Oh, absolutely.
I don't
But how do you decide on which thought that you have to act upon it? In other words, you say, is this the will of God, that I need to do something?
Well, Dee Dee, I'd like to jump in and just say, it's not, don't expect a quick answer, for one thing.
Yeah.
You can't Google that kind of question.
What does God
no,
think
I'm
I-
serious. I think this is a question that really deserves
Absolutely.
time and effort, prayer and study. A classic book about it was written by Leslie Weatherhead.
Yes.
Back during World War II, when their congregation in London was being bombed by the Blitz, and buildings were crumbling and people were dying, and Leslie Weatherhead preached 5 sermons
One on intentional
on the will of God.
and
That's where
circumstantial will.
those ideas were
Absolutely.
formed: the intentional will of God, the conditional will of God, and the ultimate will of God. That helps to clarify some things, that we can resist God's will, or we can cooperate with God's will. But you're asking how we can
Discern
know it.
That's right.
to
How
begin
do you
with.
discern it
Yeah.
so that you know it for yourself? I think it has to do with, in my opinion, certain kinds of nudges In other words, if something is stronger than something else. In other words, when I feel a nudge, it's a definite thing. And like Diana says, then it's mine to do.
Yeah, I have this process I call greater than, less than. And that is, if I'm thinking about doing something, and you're exactly right, Stephen, I agree with you. It takes time and discernment, and maybe talking to people.
Oh,
but
definitely talking.
The longer I consider something, if I get more and more excited about doing it, if my heart warms to it, then I think it's my calling. I think it's mine to do. But if the more I think about it, the less I think it's a good idea, the more concerns I have, then I think it's not the will of God. Because we have lots of calls on us. I mean, all kinds of
Absolutely.
people will tell us what they think we should be doing.
And to me, there is I've done this all my life because I've written a lot, and people have asked me, where did you get the idea? Well, it didn't come from me, and I have a lot of ideas that I can't follow through on. I just throw them on the wall and see what sticks. But the ones that
stick
won't turn me loose, then I've got to do something about it. It's the ones that say, okay, I've told you this more than once, do something about this. And to me, that's how I discern it. And not everybody probably does it that way, but I do think there are nudges that are stronger than others. And because everybody gets ideas all the time.
Yeah.
I keep thinking about Peter and his denial. Because he was the rock. He had the assignment already very clearly.
Absolutely.
Directly from Jesus.
And who he was.
And I keep thinking of him out there in the dark, while all the interrogation and the other stuff was going on inside. And, he said, oh, no, I never knew him. I wasn't there. I'm not one of them. But he kept getting pegged by witnesses that put the onus on him. And he came through that with an intention of the will of God in his life, obviously.
Well, and
in retrospect.
that is a perfect example of intentional will.
It is.
In other words, Jesus appointed Peter with a certain specific chore to do: build the church.
Well, and I love the earlier story when he saw the Lord and God said, Jesus said, well, step out of the boat.
Yeah.
And that's one of my favorite passages. Well, come on, step out. Step out. Well, that's when the will of God is working on me, and I say, oh, I don't think I want to do that. Oh, I'm not up to it. Oh, I'm just not. Oh, I can't.
Maybe tomorrow.
Well,
maybe.
Isn't there a book titled "Get Out of the Boat"?
Yeah.
You can't do anything till you step out of the boat, which indicates you've got in faith you've got to move on. If God calls you to come, you've got to get out of the boat.
Well, and then the denouement of that story was that Jesus just didn't let him just sink to the bottom, which he would have done. He said, okay, come on.
Yeah.
You got a little more growing to do. And that's happened to me a couple of times, significantly over time. It took me a long time to catch on that I wasn't allowed to drown.
Even if you tried and failed.
Oh yeah, right. And I wasn't prepared to swim by myself.
Right.
Or just walk on the water. But it somehow I was lifted up by something beyond me.
Absolutely.
And I think that's what may be helpful to somebody else to say, hey, just give it time, or give it a try. See if you can't just work through this. Maybe today is. We're going through some little crises in our family right now, and it's a lot of it's attitude and a sense, oh man, there's some loss here. How do I work through this? And it's getting better, but it's going to take a while to work through that to the point where it's resolved, and that we can move on with life. At lunchtime. My wife heard someone who had had a similar surgery 15 years ago, and this woman is now 98 years old, just just perky as they come. She can't see, can't hear, but she just is, she's a light, you know, they see it on her face.
Yeah, wonderful.
And just, you know, she's so grateful for anybody who helps her, just the least little thing. And I think, well, that's a story.
It's an inspiration.
And her name
Absolutely.
is Shug, you know.
Well, to me, I think that, and see if you all agree, that when God nudges you to do something, He gives you the tools to do it.
And I also think the courage. I think at some point,
Yeah,
I mean, on
true.
a daily basis, besides
true,
being
it's
grateful
courage.
for all the many blessings I have, I also pray for courage, because living life takes a certain amount of courage.
Excellent, I agree.
Because
It does. It certainly does.
Well, sometimes the nudge is to pick up the tools. He doesn't just put them in your hands and you instantly know how to use them.
But He has
I
them,
think it can be a process.
Yes.
One of my favorite prayers includes a phrase that says, "Help me to turn my will over to the care of God." Not just to God's will, but to God's care. And God may operate a little differently than we do. I know that's heretical to say, you know, that,
that we don't
But-
have it all figured out.
but God is caring for us while we're trying to struggle with all of this willpower kind of stuff. And I know a watershed event in my life at one point helped me see the difference between trying to exercise my will versus being willing.
excellent
Just
point.
being willing to be led by God. And, you know, it's not always about power struggles and what God's will is. It's just entrusting yourself to the care of God.
That's a good note in which to close this out. Thank you all for a very, very in-depth discussion. I hope we've helped those of you who are listening. We would like to hear from you. Please consider emailing us. Our email address is on the bottom of the screen. We'd love to hear from you. In the meanwhile, may God surround you with His grace.